Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama on Rajya Sabha Television with me, Frank Pereira. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have happened around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. United Nations Security Council approves resolution endorsing international roadmap for a Syrian peace process, but alongside demands for a ceasefire and talks, differences persist on the fate of Assad government there. Signaling an economic recovery, US Fed hikes rates for the first time in nearly a decade, albeit in a small way. All eyes on the immediate and long-term impact of the rate hike on developing and poorer economies. In the week after a landmark climate deal, the UN as well as developed and developing countries stress on commitment and implementation as the way forward as they hail the agreement. And Mother Teresa will be declared a saint next year after Pope Francis approved a second miracle attributed to her intercession. Our top focus on the program this week. The UN Security Council unanimously approved a resolution this week endorsing an international roadmap for a Syria peace process. Despite persisting divides over the future of President Assad, the US and Moscow came up with a rare show of unity on a conflict that has claimed more than 250,000 lives. Here's a report.
A UN blessing to plan for much-needed peace in Syria. One of the strongest appeals for peace by the Security Council, divided for years on the issue of the Syrian war. Moscow and Washington, who have had very different views on what should happen in Syria and the future of its president Bashar al-Assad, decided to look beyond and clinched a text.
Under the resolution approved today, the purpose of those negotiations between the responsible opposition and the government is to facilitate a transition within Syria to a credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance within 6 months. The process would lead to the drafting of a new constitution and arrangements for internationally supervised election within 18 months.
Here it is underscored that only inclusive dialogue can put an end to the untold suffering of the Syrian people. Here there is also affirmation of the fundamental principles of the political settlement, namely that Syria should remain unified, secular, pluri-religious and pluri-ethnic, comfortable and safe for all group of its people. Only the Syrian people themselves can define their future. This is a clear response to attempts to impose a solution from the outside on Syrians on any issues including those regarding its president.
The resolution, the biggest hope yet for peace returning to war-ravaged Syria, puts forth an elaborate plan. At the outset, it calls for a ceasefire, talks between the Syrian government and opposition, and a roughly 2-year timeline to create a unity government and hold elections. The resolution said talks should begin in early January. Options for monitoring a ceasefire are to be presented to the United Nations within 1 month. It also endorsed a continued battle to defeat Islamic State militants who have seized large swaths of both Syria and neighboring Iraq. It's still not entirely united though. The major powers remain bitterly divided on who may represent the opposition as well as on the future of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
The process necessarily involves the departure of Bashar al-Assad, not only for moral reasons, because of the destruction he's unleashed upon his own people, but also for practical reasons, because it will never be possible to bring peace and unity to Syria as long as he remains in office.
We think that Syrian people alone should determine who they want to rule them, under which standards and which rules.
Nearly 4 years of the Syrian crisis, its expansion and complications turning the country into an international theatre of war has killed more than 250,000 people. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged the members of the International Syria Support Group to put pressure on Syrian parties to stop using weapons against civilians, allow access for aid convoys, stop attacks on hospitals and schools, and release detainees. at least there's a ray of hope ahead. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, joining me on the program now to talk about this is Waiel, Awwad, the West Asia expert. Thank you for joining me on Rajya Sabha Television and welcome. As far as this deal is concerned, are you surprised with this rare show of unity between Russia and the United States of America?
I think it's a high time that we have seen the international community, including the superpower, joining hand. I think after the Russians started the campaign against IS since September end, we have seen the result on the ground. And we could see the people of the IS terrorist organization fleeing away from Syria. Are they also getting destroyed total their infrastructure and arms and ammunition? So we can see 80% of it destroyed. And the determination of the Russian government in bringing down this IS and ended the phenomenon in Syria, at least for the moment, it has prompted the international community, including the US and the 5 UN Security Council permanent member, to sit down across the table and decide the future. Because at the end of the day, it is the terrorism you are addressing here. It's nothing to do with the political track of the Syrian government, which has to be side by side as well.
And talking about the the politics and the government that is there in Syria, what happens now to Assad? Because there's no word about it, there's no mention of what's going to happen in the future.
See, from the beginning of the crisis, Syrian government has made it very clear that for a political solution to the Syrian problem, they are ready to discuss and call all the opposition party, have a national government and all. Why it took the international community 5 years to listen to what the Syrian government has been saying? The Russians have made it very clear that the Syrian government has nothing to do with the fighting of terrorism. So therefore, let the Syrian people decide the future, who should lead the country. And I think the ballot will be the best decision maker for any country. And as being in India, as we say, let the democracy take its own course in Syria. So why 50% of our population is internally and externally displaced? Many people got killed. Who will bring back these people alive? The solution to the Syrian crisis from day one, it is a political. No one can have a military solution against the Syria, neither from external intervention nor from internally. So therefore, Syrian track has to go along with the military track, side by side with the support of the international community, where we can see a transitional period of Syria, where we will see that the restoring of democracy and regaining all the ground, the lost ground to the terrorist organization, eliminating terrorism. I think there will be a better future. At least we are retaining the integrity and sovereignty of the state as well.
With this unity now, these unified, the force coming against and fighting against the Islamic State, do you believe that the immediate crisis has been averted, or not? I wouldn't say averted, but the immediate crisis is being addressed, at least for now?
I think, look, this is very important now. There is an international, what we call the international new orders. We need to listen to what could be that UN is the best place to go and get a resolution out for solving the crisis all over the world. And if this is the time now for the UN to act, to find a solution to this crisis, I think this is what prompted the international community. The influx of the Syrian refugees, the dead in the sea, and the challenges from the returnees of those terrorist organizations who have been trained, hubbed, transferred through Turkey into Syria, and then went back to their own country to create havoc that side. So that avalanche being created inside Syria has to put an end. And then you destroy the infrastructure of it. Look at the countries that are taking immediately the steps, fastest step. Turkey closed the border, trying to close the border with Syria. Now they're saying we are capturing lots of terrorists. Excuse me, for the last 5 years, you could not capture all these mercenaries who went to Syria. Now they're saying more than 35,000 people, they didn't let them cross from 120 countries. That means what we were doing for the last 5 years. I think we have to address those countries responsible for the spread of this phenomena and also address the real causes of the terrorism in the region. After that, the international community has to face and has to fight it together. No country can fight terrorism alone.
Indeed, no country can fight terrorism alone. That's a very interesting point that you've made there. Thank you so much, Waiel Awwad, for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Well, on that note, of course, we'll slip into a short break and much more international news coming up on the other side. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, the US Federal Reserve hiked interest rates for the first time in nearly a decade, signaling faith that the US economy had largely overcome the wounds of the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. The impact on Asian markets and emerging economies seems negligible immediately after the hike. But analysts say that the move is significant because it's widely seen as the first step in a longer sequence of rate increases over the next couple of years. Here's more.
.25%. That's how small it is. But it's above the near zero mark that US interest rates have held on to since 2006. Since 2007-8, the Fed has been flooding the market with cash in the hope that this will boost the economy. Now the Fed is starting to reverse course, looking at inflation moving back towards its 2% target. The policy statement noted considerable improvement in the US labor market, unemployment down to 5%, making conditions ripe for the rate hike. A compromise of sorts between policymakers who have been ready to raise rates for months and those who feel the economy is still at risk from weak inflation and slow global growth.
I think it's important not to overblow the significance of this first move. It's only 25 basis points. Monetary policy remains accommodative. We have indicated that we will be watching what happens very carefully in the economy in terms of our actual and forecast, our projected conditions relative to our employment and inflation goals.
The more important question is what the Fed does ahead. The central bank made it clear that the rate hike was a tentative beginning to a gradual tightening cycle, an answer to US policymakers who were hoping for a slow rise in rates, but one that will keep the Fed ahead of the curve as the economic recovery continues. US stocks rallied on the news, in part because the Fed made clear it would proceed slowly with further tightening.
They had sort of pre-announced this hike. Everybody talked about it. Everybody given speeches on it, that is to say the Fed officials. So it's almost like if they didn't do it, they were going to lose credibility. So I think they wanted to get this out of the way. And then from now on, I think they're going to proceed very carefully and very slowly.
Also closely watched, the impact the Fed rate hike would have on markets worldwide. Asian markets were the first to get the news on opening. Seeing it as a mark of confidence in the world's largest economy, stock markets, the Japanese Nikkei, Korea Composite Stock Price Index, and Hong Kong's benchmark Hang Seng all jumped. Indian stocks reacted unaffected, in fact positively too, up over 300 points the day after. China says the rate hike will have some impact on its trade in the longer run. How much remains to be seen. How emerging economies react in the longer term is being closely watched.
会不会有影响？我想是第一，这个美联储加息对中国的对外经贸，包括外贸、出口、进口、投资，多方面应该都会有一些直接或间接的影响。第二呢，这个影响有多大？现在还要做具体的分析啊，根据它加息的情况，加息的幅度。
It already is raising the dollar and therefore putting downward pressure on emerging market currencies.
A rate hike by the US Fed is likely to prod the UK to hike its rates too soon, given that the two have moved in tandem in the past. A whole lot of fallout possibilities open up there too. A global economic overhaul in the offing. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, you can watch a detailed discussion on the impact the US Fed rate hike would have on India on Policy Watch at 10 p.m. on Saturday and 8 a.m. on Sunday. Moving on, now the already simmering tensions between Russia and Turkey over shooting down of a Russian plane fired up again this week. Russia fired towards a Turkish boat in the Aegean Sea, claiming they were warning shots to avoid a collision. Turkey called it massive violation and provocation. The incident is the latest in the series of heated exchanges between Russia and Turkey since the shooting down of a Russian fighter plane last month. Russia has already intensified economic sanctions against Turkey. The incident featured large during Russian President Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation media conference on Thursday. There were strong words and a sense of stopping short of more rancor.
We believe that the actions taken by Turkish authorities with respect to our plane, which they shot down, were not unfriendly but act of enmity. I don't understand why they did it. What have they achieved? Did they think that we would run away from here? Of course not. Russia is not that kind of country. On the level of bilateral state relations, I don't see prospects to improve ties with the current Turkish leadership. But on the humanitarian level, I certainly do.
Well, let's take a look now at some other news-making events that made headlines across the world this week in GlobeWatch.
Saudi Arabia has formed a coalition of 34 mainly Muslim countries, including powers such as Egypt and Turkey, to coordinate a fight against terrorist organizations. Arab countries such as Qatar and the UAE will join the coalition, as well as Middle Eastern, Asian and African states, including Pakistan, Malaysia and Nigeria. However, Iran is not a member of the alliance. Saudi Defense Minister and Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who announced the alliance, said the states would work together to target any terrorist organization, not just ISIL, in countries including Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt and Afghanistan. The United States welcomed the announcement. A former neighbor accused of supplying assault rifles to the couple who massacred 14 people in San Bernardino in California has been charged with providing material support to terrorists, unlawful purchase of assault rifles, and defrauding immigration authorities. Enrique Marquez, friend of one of the shooters, told investigators he and Farouk plotted earlier mass casualty attacks. The two men allegedly also conspired to commit vicious assaults on targets including a California community college and a state highway during rush hour. Norway tops the UN Human Development Report for the 12th year running, named the best country in the world to live in on criteria of life expectancy, education and income or standard of living. Norway gets a rating of 0.94, where 1 is the maximum. Australia is at second place, just a fraction behind at 0.935. Scores are calculated by crunching data on what the UN says are the 3 basic dimensions of human development. The US comes in at 8, the UK at 14. At the bottom of the list are Eritrea, Chad and Burundi.
Well, the historic Paris climate deal puts the world on the road to possible corrections of a century and more of environmental abuse. The agreement overcame huge hurdles, primarily over who should own responsibility for making corrections ahead. Looking forward, the understanding now is that commitment and implementation alone can enable a real difference towards saving the planet.
And a deal that at least outwardly promises key corrections towards limiting the global warming threat. Strong efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a 5-year ratcheting mechanism in climate action, taking note of key issues of differentiation and loss and damage. Post the agreement, world leaders called for commitment and implementation as the way forward.
The Paris Agreement is a victory for the common good and for multilateralism. It is a health insurance policy for the planet. It is the most significant action in years to uphold our charter mandate to save succeeding generations. For the first time, every country in the world has pledged to curb emissions, strengthen resilience, and to act internationally and domestically to address climate change. Now I count on governments and all sectors of our society to turn this commitment into urgent and decisive action.
Noticeably, there were no outright victories or winners. The agreement came about with acceptance of win some, lose some, and compromise on others. Listing out the big issues and their resolution. At the top, differentiation. Developing countries wanted the developed world to take greater responsibility for climate actions. The Paris Agreement invokes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, 4 times. Developed countries have been asked to set economy-wise absolute emission reduction targets. They have to provide financing and support to poorer nations to deal with climate change. Developing nations are only encouraged to do so. Second, finance. Developed countries will provide $100 billion every year from 2020, but they will not scale it up from the subsequent year as was being demanded by developing countries. Developing countries are encouraged to raise funds too, even if on a voluntary basis. On the temperature goal, there's a compromise mentioning both targets. Keep global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees, while pursuing efforts to keep it below 1.5. And fourth, National Determined Contributions, NDCs. Every country has been asked to communicate an NDC every 5 years, each one an improvement on the last. World leaders termed the agreement one that had to include all nations without exception and the best chance to save the planet.
While our generation will see some of the benefits of building a clean energy economy, jobs created, money saved, we may not live to see the full realization of our achievement, but that's okay. What matters is that today we can be more confident that this planet is going to be in better shape for the next generation, and that's what I care about.
Climate justice has won. Environment has won. Future generations have got promise that they will get much better earth. This time, the whole world is united and a robust action plan is decided.
Several activists and commentators insist the deal doing away with the principle of historical responsibility on the industrialized nations is a setback, leaving a lot of areas inadequately addressed. Overall, though, there's a feeling that the action has to begin now.
So there's still a lot of work to do to make additional progress on country commitments, but I think what this does is it sends a powerful signal that that is possible. It's going to drive investments in the marketplace. Any investor that doesn't read this and say, I ought to be getting out of long-term fossil fuel investments and converting my investment portfolio to clean energy, ought to have their head examined, because this is a clear signal of the direction of travel over time. Will we be able to close that remaining 2/3 entirely before 2030? That remains to be seen.
To the common man, what the Paris conference did achieve was greater awareness of the dangers of global warming and signals of the damage already visible on the planet. Looking ahead, commitment and implementation remain the key words. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Moving on now, Mother Teresa will be anointed a saint in 2016 after Pope Francis approved a miracle attributed to her intercession. The Vatican said Pope Francis approved a decree attributing a second miracle to Mother Teresa's intercession. It set no date for the canonization, but it is widely believed that it will take place in the first week of September to coincide with the 19th anniversary of Mother Teresa's death and during Francis's Holy Year of Mercy. Pope John Paul II, one of Mother Teresa's greatest champions, had waived the normal 5-year waiting period for her beatification process to begin and launched it a year after she died in 1997. Well, let's shift focus now and bring you up to speed with some sports news from around the world in our segment Sports Action.
Chelsea on Thursday sacked manager Jose Mourinho 7 months after he led them to the Premier League title. The 52-year-old Portuguese had been in his second spell at the club, taking charge in June 2013. Chelsea finished 8 points clear last season and won the League Cup, but have lost 9 of their 16 league games so far and are 16th in the table, 1 point above the relegation places. Pep Guardiola, Hidnik, Juan de Ramos and Brendan Rodgers have all been touted as possible successors as Blues owner begins another managerial search. The draw for the knockout stage of the Champions League was announced on Monday, with holders Barcelona facing off against Arsenal. Chelsea were drawn against Paris Saint-Germain, while last year's finalist Juventus will face Bayern Munich. The first legs will be played on February 16th and 17th and 23rd, 24th, while the return legs will be played on March 8th, 9th and 15th, 16th. Women's tennis ace Serena Williams was named Sportsperson of 2015 by Sports Illustrated magazine. Williams won 3 major titles, triumphed in 53 of the 56 matches she played, and ranked number 1 for every week of the season for the 2nd straight year. The magazine said it was honoring the 34-year-old icon both for her positively stunning numbers and a pluck in achieving what it called one of the greatest late career runs in the history of any sport. Rome will become only the 3rd Ryder Cup host from continental Europe after Italy pipped Germany, Spain and Austria in the bidding race to stage the 44th edition of the matches in 2022. There were initially 7 bidders, but Denmark, Portugal and Turkey withdrew their interest in the early stages. The next edition of the biennial team event will be held in Minnesota in September 2016, while Wisconsin is to stage the matches in 2020.
And finally, as we enter Christmas week, we leave you today with glimpses of celebrations around the world, from record-making Christmas trees to New Age Santas, all reveling in the season. Have a very Merry Christmas and compliments of the season. I'm Frank Pereira, signing off.